Welcome back to the channel, Tenta Outdoors. My name is Alan from Season 10 of Alone. Today's video, Alone, Season 11, Episode 5, Recap. Folks, before I get into the recap, I just want to go over two little fun trivia facts about Alone Season 10. The first one is, Season 10 contestants hold the record for the longest number of days spent in the field before anyone leaves the game. So the first contestant last year left on day 18. Season 10 holds another record. If you know what that record is, put it in the comments, and the first person that gets that right, I don't know, I'll give you a shout out in our next recap video. Holy smokes, what an episode this was. So the show starts out with Timber killing a 1,200-pound moose with his recurve bow. I don't even know what to say, just wow. Timber is an absolute beast. I was super happy when Timber made an excellent shot on that moose. He waited for a broadside shot, got really good penetration, and he made a quick, clean, ethical kill on that moose, and it did not go far. So let's talk about some myths that I've heard online and chat groups and things like that about the bows that contestants take on Alone not having enough energy or power to kill large game like moose or bear. Timber totally proved all the doubters wrong, and according to the edit, that moose was down in like 10 to 15 seconds. So if you wait for a good broadside shot, I'm gonna guess that his recurve bow is probably around 50 pounds, pretty standard weight. And a 50-pound bow with a proper arrow weight and a good sharp broadhead, and if the arrow's flying true and clean out of that bow, has no problem making full penetration on a moose of that size. It's pretty incredible how quickly and easily an arrow can pass through that much muscle mass and tissue and hide to get into the vital organs and make a quick, effective kill on an animal of that size. Timber waited till that moose was close. He waited till it was broadside, and he made a shot into the vital area. It appeared like it was right behind the front leg, and behind the front leg there's the heart and there's both lungs. So good for him for waiting for that perfect shot, and his arrow obviously penetrated both lungs, because as he started running away, Timber could hear kind of the gurgling noise as his lungs were filling up with blood, and it expired very quickly after that. So according to the edit, it seemed like Timber skinned and processed that moose very quickly. But trust me, he would have spent hours skinning and butchering that moose, and he did it very effectively and very efficiently given the situation that he was in. Timber lights a fire right beside the kill site, and the idea behind that is that he wants to mix the smell of smoke in with the smell of the kill site to let the grizzlies know that this kill is owned by man. Now, in theory, it's not a bad idea, and it's not going to do any harm or anything like that, but realistically, if a grizzly knows that there's a moose kill there in a gut pile, I really don't think the grizzly's going to care if there's a little bit of smoke mixed in with the scent, and he's going to move on in and take that moose anyway. So Timber finishes processing the top half of the moose, and he decides to leave the bottom half for the next morning. Now obviously he's exhausted, he's already running on low fuel, and the amount of work that he just did to process that first half of the moose can't be underestimated. I've processed quite a few moose in my life with more than one person, and it's a lot of work. One thing that I wish Timber did do to the moose, and he may have done it, but they didn't show it. So before he went back to his shelter and leaving that half a moose overnight, I wished he had got some sticks and slid them underneath the remaining half of the carcass, just to kind of get it up off the ground a tiny little bit to allow air to circulate underneath it. And it appears that he left the hide on as well, so that hide acts as a real insulator. I mean, it keeps the moose warm, it keeps the heat from leaving the moose, so obviously it's going to prevent it from cooling down as quickly, especially if it's against the ground. So I'm hoping that he slid some sticks under there to help the air circulate to cool the remaining half of the carcass. When Timber got back to his shelter, he also mentioned that he covered up the remaining half of the moose with the hide from the first half of the moose he skinned. So he covered it up like a blanket. Now, it would protect it from birds and whatnot, but what that does do, it holds the heat in. Not allowing your meat to cool down properly overnight would expedite the spoiling process. The question that all audience members are thinking, is he going to be able to process this moose and preserve it, keep it cool enough to prevent spoilage. Timber finds a cool spot by the riverbank, he digs it out, and he builds a large food cache to store his meat. To the viewers, it would appear that Timber has this game in the bag. But having that much meat and dealing with this moose that he's got down on the ground presents a whole new set of challenges. Number one, it's the weather. Will the weather cool down? Will he be able to preserve and smoke enough of the meat to make him go the distance in the game? Number two, he's got to protect it from predators. Man, everything in that forest is going to want to eat that meat. And his biggest worry, obviously, is grizzlies. So I just want to discuss his food cache a little bit. Now, that is a great food cache. Don't get me wrong. It's massive, it's strong, he's got it reinforced. But let's be honest. We as human beings, it's hard to comprehend the strength and power and determination that a grizzly would have if he knew there was an entire moose inside that cache. I promise you, if a grizzly wanted to get in there, a grizzly would get in there very, very easily. Just a comparison, I mean, black bears are much smaller and much weaker than grizzly bears, but there are black bears that can actually rip open car doors with their claws if they know there's a cooler of food inside. Timber's next scene shows him chasing out a mink that has found a way into his food cache and is helping himself to the fat underneath the heart. They show Timber with his shirt off. That's just telling us how warm the weather actually is, and it makes me concerned about how long that meat's going to last in that food cache before he starts smoking it. Timber knows that everything that's going to want to break into that cache of moose meat is going to want to go for the fat first. And he also realizes that it's the fat that he needs the most. So he starts harvesting all the fat out of his cache, and his plan is to render down as much of it as possible. Now, rendering, if you're not sure what that means, it's a process where you collect the fat and you boil it. You boil it for a period of time, you get it very hot, it melts down, and it evaporates all the moisture that's in the fat. It also kind of gets rid of any impurities like bits of meat or gristle that are also in the fat. They kind of float to the top and you can get rid of them. But once you render the fat, its shelf life expands tremendously. It can last for a very, very long time as rendered fat. And now he needs something to store this rendered fat, and so Timber's pretty smart, man. He's doing a really, really good job, and I'm super impressed with his skills and his ability to think through things and solve problems. He makes these birch bark canisters. So he just peels off a nice slab of birch bark, seals the end with a round, and uses it as a very effective container to store all his fat. Timber's next play is very smart. Instead of building a whole new smoker and wasting all those calories on making another building, he simply turns his cabin into a massive smoker. And he's got a really good shot of how much meat is actually hanging up in there, and he gets to work on the smoking process. As he was slicing up his meat for smoking, he talked about how some of it is very dirty because the mink was wallowing in it. Now, I'm hoping that Timber cut away those contaminated parts of the meat, because when Timber's doing so well in the game right now, man, you don't want to take any chances and get sick from not being careful with your meat. I hope he sliced it away and discarded it. Timber shared with the audience how he went through some hard times in his life and how nature helped him heal. He also spoke a lot about gratitude and how much he has and how much being outside makes him feel so thankful. The episode moves on to Michaela. Michaela talks about how her feet are kind of bothering her. They're becoming very moist and wet, and perhaps she's feeling some effects of her feet being wet for long periods of time. So to combat this, she grabs some charcoal from her fire, she breaks it up, and she rubs it all over her feet. Now the idea behind this is the charcoal will absorb the moisture and help her feet dry out. And with less moisture, it makes it harder for bacteria to thrive, and in turn will reduce some odor. What Michaela is dealing with right now with her feet is the reason why I did not bring those insulated rubber boots that are quite popular amongst alone contestants. Instead of those insulated rubber boots, I chose to bring leather hunting boots that have a Gore-Tex lining. So what's nice about leather hunting boots with a Gore-Tex lining is that they breathe. They're fully waterproof, but you don't get that sweaty feet problem that quite a few alone contestants end up dealing with. Now, the only reason I knew that is because I have a pair of those boots and I've worn them in the bush while I'm exerting myself, And man, my feet got really wet and they're quite uncomfortable, and personally, I don't like them. Michaela is shown checking her trap line, but unfortunately her snares are empty. Shortly after that, she spots a grouse in a tree and she's able to get 2 shots at the grouse using her flu arrows. Unfortunately, she isn't able to connect with her shots, but she does end up finding both of her arrows. Now, I just want to speak a little bit about the flu arrows. Now, a flu arrow is an arrow with extra fletching glued on. So the whole idea behind flu arrows is that that extra fletching at the back. So instead of having 3 fletching, it might have 6 fletching, and they're longer and usually a lot higher than standard fletching. So the arrow will travel at almost normal speed for the first 15 to 25 yards, and shortly after that, that extra resistance at the back end of the arrow really slows down the arrow quickly, so it's much easier to find if you miss a shot. I've spoken about this before, but man, it is hard hitting a grouse high up in a tree. I mean, the actual meat part of the grouse isn't much bigger than my fist. So to hit a grouse in a tree, I know it as an audience member, it seems like it should be easy, but it's definitely not. And plus you've got that added stress of knowing that if I miss this, oh my gosh, I'm not gonna have the food. So coupled with that stress and how small that target is and shooting at awkward angles, it's hard to hit grouse in trees, it really is. Michaela then shares with the audience that she's really starting to feel some anxiety about being out there, and she's starting to worry. She finds an abandoned bird's nest and thoughtfully puts it aside as an easy fire starter for when it gets cold. I was impressed with how much thought Michaela put into her shelter. She considered the north winds, she considered the south-facing side to soak up as much radiant heat from the sun, and she kept it small and simple. Michaela speaks about a breakdown she had when she was younger and how the healing power of nature got her through it. That statement really resonated with me because, man, when I'm feeling stressed, when I'm feeling anxious, when I'm out in nature by myself, man, I can feel my heartbeat slowing down and I can just feel the stress leaving my body. The next scene is pretty interesting. Michaela's pictured standing there and she hears this horrible squealing noise. And when she goes to investigate, she finds that a marten had just killed a rabbit. And no, I don't think alone is exaggerating the noise that the rabbit made as it was being killed by the marten, because rabbits do make this kind of bone-chilling, almost like a scream when they're dying. It's quite unsettling. So I don't think they pushed that one. I think it was legit. And man, what a gift that marten left for Michaela. How lucky for her for that marten to get scared off and leave the kill for Michaela to consume. So she grabs the rabbit, cleans it up, and consumes it in her shelter. So the next few scenes the editors really put together to send a message to the audience that Michaela may be thinking about leaving the competition. She sees a family of swans and mentions to the audience that she wants to start her own family. So as Michaela is setting up a squirrel pole, which is just a pole leaned against a tree with a series of snares on it, and the thought behind that is as the squirrel's taking a shortcut to climb up the tree, they'll get caught in one of the series of snares on that pole, and as they get caught, they fall off and strangle themselves. And as she's setting that up, she stops, and you can tell she's becoming quite upset. She speaks about how she's really finding the mental game tough, she's lonely, and she's struggling, and she's not liking it. This scene really shows how tough the mental part of the lone experience is, and that you never really know how you're going to react when you're in isolation, living alone, without any kind of social contact, and you're not eating enough. The next scene, Michaela is shown checking her gill net, and there's a very nice sized pike trapped in her gill net. She takes it out of the gill net and she releases it back into the water. She said it just doesn't feel right. And at this point, I think we all knew that Michaela was done with her experience on the show. After 18 days, Michaela taps out of the competition. She said she's having a very hard time dealing with the social isolation, and she needs community and connection. The episode then moves on to Jake. Now, Jake got very little airtime this episode, and I don't know what to think about that. You got to remember that editors are very good at making the audience think things that they want them to think. So I don't know what to think about that. Jake's first scene is him explaining how he sat on a rock and he ended up snapping his tailbone, but he's not worried about it. Jake definitely is exhibiting some toughness in this game. Jake is checking his gill net at the river's edge, and he has 2 large pike in his gill net. He definitely found the right spot for his gill net. I mean, even though he lost his fishing line and his hooks, he's doing very well with his gill net. And the 2 pike that he pulls out of there, one of the pike had a very large burbot stuck in its mouth. And when he laid it down on the beach beside the other pike, it's like almost the same size as the pike. So the next time you're pike fishing and you're wondering if your lure is too big, it's not. Now that scene where Jake was pulling the burbot out of that fish's mouth reminds me of something that happened to me out there. It was my first night and it was the very first fish that I caught. I carved a wooden lure soon after I got there and I hooked a pike quite quickly, and when I pulled it in, it had a burbot stuck in its mouth as well. It wasn't as big as the one Jake had, but it was definitely like 15 inches long or so. Now, because it was the first day and I was so stuffed, I was overweight, and I actually wasn't hungry. And when I pulled the burbot out of the mouth of the pike, it was partially digested, like its head and its meat. You could tell the digestive juices of the pike had been working on that burbot. And what I did was probably stupid. I pulled it out, I held it up to the camera. They didn't show any of this, and I threw it back in the water. And I said to the camera, I go, on day 1, I ain't eating that, but on day 50, I probably would have. Next up on this episode was Dub. Now, I've noticed that you're really starting to see the weight loss on the faces of the contestants. Dub is shown fortifying his shelter with mixing mud and horsetails. You know, I really like Dub's shelter. I like the simplicity of it. I like the way he dug out the bank and used the bank as the back wall. I like the way he built his fire pit in the back against that back wall. And even though it ain't pretty, man, I think it's awesome. Now, the editors did a good job putting in this scene with Dub after we know that Timber harvested a moose. He starts talking about big game, Dub does. He starts talking about big game and how you have a really good chance of winning if you do get big game. And he's right. But then he says he thinks it's irresponsible of a contestant to take a big game animal in this weather. Now, if Dub and Timber were watching this episode together, because I know they posted about them watching the last episode together in a hotel room. If they're watching it together, and Timber heard him say that, I don't think Timber spoke to Dub for the rest of the episode. And maybe, just maybe, he threw his bowl of popcorn at Dub. Had to change locations because I stepped on a ground's nest of hornets over there. Man, filming these recaps is dangerous business. Last year filming recaps, I got charged by a black bear and a tree almost fell on me. The next scene shows Dub fishing with whitefish, and he makes a comment wondering if whitefish are cannibalistic. Then he makes a joke about him chewing on a femur. The episode moves on to Dub in his shelter. There's quite a bit of smoke, and he's doing like a rap, and he's pretending that he's at a rave. He goes on to say how his head is not feeling right, and he's kind of feeling sick, he's not feeling sharp, and it's got to be due to the smoke inhalation and lack of food. Those two things together can definitely have an impact on the old melon. I want to talk a little bit about the smoke in his shelter. I mean, Dub does have a fireplace in the back, but he could have just started the fire and it might not be drafting yet. Who knows? This is just according to the edit. It does appear that he might need to do some work on the chimney, some experimentation to prevent the smoke from coming back out in his shelter and going up the chimney. Dub's a smart guy. I'm sure he will figure it out. He makes a comment to the camera that he knows if he doesn't get food in the next couple days, he's worried that he's going to fall into a downward spiral. And up on the screen, it shows that he has lost 20 pounds so far. The episode moves into a fishing scene. Dub is at the side of the river, and he's got a set line out in the water, and they show him making what's called a spring pole fishing rod. So the whole idea behind that is it's got a device just like a spring snare. So he's got the tree or the rod bent over with tension on it and string coming down onto a notch-on-notch connection in the ground. And when the fish bites on the line and puts some pressure on it, it'll pull the notch-to-notch connection apart, releasing the spring snare, and hopefully setting the hook. So during this scene, when he's setting up all his stuff, he actually catches a fish on a set line, good sized pike, well done. And as he's processing that first fish, his spring snare actually goes off, and it worked perfectly, and he landed both fish. I think it's awesome how he was able to get that on camera. And during orientation camp, they always tell the contestants, keep cameras running all the time. Have something going because you never know what's going to happen. And that was a really good example of why you should have a camera going at all times. It was really interesting seeing that spring snare, or sorry, not spring snare, spring pole in action. Dub then discusses how there's going to be a period in the game during freeze up that you're not going to be able to fish. And you're going to have to rely on hunting and trapping during that time until the ice becomes thick enough to walk on, which is about 4 inches thick. He then says that fishing will not get you all the way in the game. Dub is right about that, but if you store and smoke enough fish to get you through that period of freeze up, then you're golden. The episode then features Isaiah, and they show Isaiah brushing his teeth with a piece of charcoal. As he's working on his large shelter that he calls the bunker, he mentions that his military experience may give him a leg up on his competitors. He mentioned that he hasn't eaten that day, and he hasn't had protein since day 6. I am a little bit concerned about his expenditure of calories and the lack of calories going in. Hopefully he procures some food quickly. The next scene shows Isaiah waking up to wolves howling in the distance. What a special, cool experience he had. It's happened to me on several occasions, and it is pretty eerie, but at the same time, it's pretty special. He shares with the camera that wolves do scare him. So here's some stats on wolf attacks. Worldwide, in the last 18 years, there's been 2 fatalities caused by wolves. So the chance of being attacked by a wolf are above 0, but far too low to even calculate. So it's day 16. Isaiah wakes up and he said he's going to push to get his shelter done. He just wants it off his plate. Now the only issue I have with that kind of plan is that fishing doesn't usually get better as you move further into the game. So, I mean, I think it would be a good idea if he did both, works on a shelter for a time and does some fishing. So Isaiah makes enough progress on his shelter to get the tarp on it, and I'm assuming that he moved into the shelter and is going to sleep there and just work on it kind of on an ongoing basis to finish it up and fortify it. As always, folks, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you got a few extra tidbits of information. And don't forget to tune in next Friday for my next recap. We'll see you next time.